Good evening. I see you have returned for some more spooky tales. We're going to start with two real-life stories from ghosts and the paranormal. The first location takes us to Canada, and this is called Screaming Tunnel, Niagara. Now, Niagara Falls is one of the great wonders of the world, but it is also home to an awesome secret. Most visitors to this incredible attraction never get to know about this chilling story. The Grand Trunk railway line used to run along the northwest corner of Niagara Falls. Beneath it sits a narrow tunnel built in the early 1800s, just 5 metres high and 38 metres long. It was not a railway tunnel. It carried surplus water down to the valley below, and the local people used it to transport goods and animals safely under the busy railway. This apparently harmless structure is, however, known as the Screaming Tunnel, and it has a terrible past. About 100 years ago, a local girl died in this confined space. There are several versions of her tragic story. One says she lived on a nearby farm and one night escaped from one of the barns when it accidentally caught fire. Her clothes were ablaze, and desperate and in pain, she ran to the tunnel thinking that the water in it would help to put the fire out. It was too late, however, and she died screaming as the fire consumed her. In another version, she was set on fire by her father. He was consumed by fury when his wife refused him custody of their children after their divorce, and in a fit of madness turned that fury on his innocent daughter. Whatever the truth of this, her piercing screams and her terrible death remained the same. Ever since, people visiting the tunnel after dark have been chilled by sounds of a young girl's screams. It is said that if you stand in the middle of the tunnel at night and light a match, the flame terrifies the spirit of this poor girl, and the screams ring through the tunnel for all to hear. So that was Screaming Tunnel, Niagara, Canada. The next tale takes us to Epping Forest in the UK. Back in the 18th century, Epping Forest was a notoriously dangerous place. This was the hangout of highwaymen and thieves, murderers and criminals of all kinds. The most infamous highwayman of the time was Dick Turpin, and Epping was his patch. As travellers passed through the wood on horseback or in carriage, he would leap out at them from the cover of the trees and demand their valuables at gunpoint. Turpin did not stop at robbery, however. He murdered at least one man in Epping Forest, and for his crimes he was eventually hanged in York in 17 39. His imposing ghost, dressed in a long cloak and wide-brimmed hat, has been seen in the forest many times, leading walkers off the path and into the depths of the undergrowth until they are well and truly lost. Turpin's victims cannot rest in peace either. Back in the 1920s, one terrified observer told the tale of his journey through the forest with a friend. Cycling along a track, they clearly heard the sound of horses and a carriage approaching them from behind. As the creaking of the carriage and the clatter of hooves grew louder and louder, the two men stopped to let them pass. As they turned to look around, the sounds continued, but there was nothing there. There was one particular area of the forest that Turpin made his base, and that was Loughton Camp. This creepy place has an even longer history and an even more violent one. This is the place where Queen Boudicca, queen of the Iceni tribe of Britons, made the base for her army during the fight with the Romans in AD 60. Fearless Boudicca marched her soldiers into battle against the occupying Romans, but they were defeated and hacked down. Many people think that the spirits of her fearful soldiers, as they contemplated defeat on the eve of battle, linger in this gloomy place. And we have an interesting fact regarding Epping Forest. A pond within the forest draws people to their deaths. It is the site of a tragic murder-suicide of two young lovers 300 years ago. So that's those from Ghosts and the Paranormal. We're going to move to fiction now. We have a tale from More Night Frights here, a collection of short stories, and if I can locate the story of interest on page 23. This one is called Poltergeist. Maria had always had a wild imagination, so when she moved with her family into an old house in a new town, they didn't take everything she said seriously at first, but after a while they couldn't ignore what was happening. Maria's bedroom was on the second floor, just at the top of a curving flight of stairs. The very first night she slept there, a strange thing happened. She was lying under her sheets and blanket, almost dozing off to sleep. Then suddenly the covers were jerked down from the bottom of the bed. Maria lay there, shivering and screaming at the top of her lungs. Her parents ran into the room wondering what had happened. Something was in here, Maria stuttered in a shaky voice. I was lying really quiet, and all of a sudden something pulled my covers off. "Now, Maria, that's just your imagination at work," her father said. "You probably kicked them off yourself while you were having a dream." "No," Maria whimpered. "It really happened. I heard a sound on the stairway right afterwards. Something is haunting this house." Maria's parents soothed her to sleep, but they didn't pay much attention to her story until the next evening. The family was sitting around the fireplace reading after dinner. Maria was reading a book about ghosts, her eyes getting wider by the minute. Suddenly, a weird noise, almost like a mad laugh, came out of the fireplace. Then chunks of soot fell down the chimney, sending a cloud of black smoke into the room. As Maria and her mother and father jumped up, coughing and choking from the smoke, another laughing sound echoed from the chimney. "I know what it is," Maria said. "It's a poltergeist, a mean kind of ghost that likes to play tricks and scare people. I just read about them, and I think one lives here." Maria's father didn't say anything, but he quickly doused the fire and shut the vent to the chimney. Whatever might be up there, he didn't want it to come down into the house. The poltergeist left the family alone for a week. Maria's parents decided that her idea about the house being haunted was nonsense after all. They tried to find other explanations for what had happened with the fireplace. But it must have been a squirrel, they said. Then the poltergeist emerged again. Late one night there was a knock on the front door. Maria's father walked down the stairway to open it, but no one stood on the doorstep outside. No one at all. Maria's father shook his head and walked back up the stairs. As soon as he reached the top, the knocking started once more on the front door. He walked down again and opened the door, and no one was there. But out of the darkness came a mad laugh, and the door slammed shut in his face. Maria had woken up and seen what happened. She saw the look of fear on her father's face as he climbed back up the staircase. With shaking knees, she crawled back into her own bed, pulled the covers up over her head, and held onto them tightly. All was quiet. Then a tapping started on Maria's window. At first it was so quiet that she thought it must be a tree branch blown by the wind. Slowly the tapping grew louder and louder until it sounded like a desperate animal trying to get into her room. Maria tried to scream, but nothing came out of her mouth. She huddled under the covers, afraid to look at what might be outside the window. Then suddenly the tapping was inside her room. It started on her closet door, sounding like someone was inside trying to get out. Then it travelled around the room, along the walls, until it came to her bed. Tap, 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 rap, rap, rap. The sound pounded into Maria's brain. Soon it was only inches above her head. She screamed. It was the loudest, longest scream her parents had ever heard. They rushed into her bedroom to find Maria sitting straight up in her bed, her face pale and sweating. Together they heard the mad laugh of the poltergeist fade away outside the window. Maria refused to sleep in her room anymore. her parents couldn't bring themselves to argue with her. The poltergeist had gotten to them too. The next morning at breakfast, the family decided that they would have to move. No matter how much they liked their new house, they couldn't share it with the wicked poltergeist. It took Maria and her parents 3 days to pack up all the things they had moved into the house. But instead of being sad, they all felt happy that they were escaping. Maria caught herself singing as she filled boxes with her books and clothes. The moving van arrived on a Friday and loaded up the family's belongings. That night Maria slept in a sleeping bag in her parents' bedroom. Every once in a while she thought she heard strange sounds outside the window and up and down the stairway. But she just squeezed her eyes shut hard and told herself that after tonight she'd never be bothered by the poltergeist again. The next morning the family had their last breakfast in the house and loaded their bags into their station wagon. Maria sat in the back seat and turned around to look at the house one last time as her father drove down the lane. She raised her hand in a wave to the house and whispered, "Good riddance, you mean old poltergeist." As she turned around to look at the road, a familiar, haunting laugh rose from behind her. Maria heard the poltergeist's voice whisper in her ear. "Where are we going?" it asked. That was Poltergeist from Still More Night Frights. I'm going to explore some short ghost and legend stories from my trusty book from Staffordshire and the Black Country. We have covered some of these before. Let's try and find some new tales. Okay, we have the town of Burslem in Stoke-on-Trent. This is called Molly Leigh, the Hamil witch. If you lived in the Hamil area of Burslem at the beginning of the 18th century, young Molly Leigh was a girl to be wary of. She was then about 15 years old, but was already a strong-willed and difficult girl. People said that she could bend anyone and anything to her will. She had no scruples about cheating people when she sold produce, frequently selling watered milk. Moreover, she refused to attend church. Everyone was afraid of Molly. She had strange, wild eyes, and people said that if she stared at a child, she could cause it to become ill. If anyone upset her, those weird eyes would also cause cattle belonging to the offender to become lame. She had in fact the power of the evil eye. As she grew older, she preferred her own company to that of friends and neighbours. Her only companion was a black raven that perched on her shoulder whenever she went out. People noticed that this familiar would sit on the roof and watch them if they walked by her cottage, and everyone believed that it then told Molly who was passing. It was also thought significant that the hawthorn bush by her cottage never came into bloom. What went on inside the cottage was unknown, since no neighbour ever dared to enter. However, they were sure that she had dealings with the devil, entering into pacts in exchange for her supernatural gifts. On one occasion, the Reverend Thomas Spencer tried unsuccessfully to shoot Molly's raven. He spent the next 3 weeks in sheer agony, unable to walk. The villagers concluded that Parson Spencer had incurred Molly's wrath. While her company was avoided by all and sundry, most residents of the locality regarded her with a mixture of awe, fear, and respect. They knew she was a witch, but after all, she was their witch. In this way, Molly Leigh lived out her solitary life for 63 years. In March 1748, Molly died. She was buried in St. John's Churchyard by Parson Spencer on 1st April. Because she was a witch, her grave was dug north to south at right angles to all the other graves. After the burial, the parson and the mourners went first to the Turk's Head to fortify themselves with hot punch. Then they set off across Jackfield towards Molly's cottage. They intended to purify the witch's home by means of prayer and hymn singing. When they arrived at the gloomy cottage, the mourners hung back for the parson to enter first. He hesitated, then flung open the door and strode inside. Seconds later he raced out and fled back towards the Turk's Head, followed by the curious villagers. Safely ensconced in the tavern, Parson Spencer took another drink and informed the others that, as he had crossed Molly's threshold, he had seen her there, sitting by the fire. Their imaginations ran riot. They had been willing to put up with a witch among them when she was alive, but the notion of a dead witch among them was terrifying. As Molly was obviously too much for one person to cope with, it was decided that he should call in 3 more vicars from Stoke, Newchapel and Woolstanton. The 4 clergymen agreed on a plan of action. At midnight on the following Sunday, they approached Molly's grave, chanting prayers as they did so. They ordered the sexton who accompanied them to dig up the witch's coffin, then climbed down into the grave to examine it, but were startled by a hoarse croak. They looked up to see a raven perched on the rim of the hole. Convinced that this was Molly's familiar come to watch what they were doing, they panicked and ran away. However, before he fled, Parson Spencer managed to grab hold of the raven with one hand and lift the lid on the coffin with the other. He threw the fluttering bird inside, let the lid drop down again, and scuttled after his fellow preachers. Later, the foreman found the courage to return to Molly's cottage, where they prayed that the witch's ghost should leave the Hamil area forever. They may not have been completely successful, as sightings of the Hamil witch recurred through the 18th and 19th centuries. She was often heard singing, "Weight and measure sold I never, milk and water sold I never." 80 years old Mrs. Eaton, whose family had always lived in the Hamil area, tells me that she was always afraid of Molly's ghost as a child. She believed the other children's tales about the witch, until her father told her that his great-grandmother claimed she could remember Molly Leigh. Mrs. Eaton's family have always insisted that Molly was not a witch, although they admit her appearance was rough and witch-like. She discounts the tale about Molly's black raven being entombed with her, though she does fully accept the story of her ghost being seen in the cottage after her burial. The tradition in Mrs. Eaton's family was that the villagers piled extra stones on Molly's tomb to keep her spirit in. She thinks that the witch legend is due to the superstitious nature of the Burslem people of the 18th and 19th centuries. Not everyone agrees with Mrs. Eaton's assessment of Molly. Even into the 20th century, Burslem miners would not go down the pits if they ever met a cross-eyed woman on their way to work. They would not take the risk, just in case the lady with strange eyes was in fact the ghost of Molly Leigh, the Hamil witch. Mr. K. Booth of Hanley tells me that Molly's ghost still haunts the area, appearing to a friend of his whose bedroom overlooks the churchyard. Those are your spooky tales for the night. Sleep well.